Oh, seems Jenny has joined and we're recording.
Now we can record. That's great. Yeah.
So I work for a community economy organization, mostly focused on community housing, called Wessex Community Assets, and I'm also a researcher at University of Plymouth.
I just joined this meeting.
Hi, Jenny. Shall I pass on to Jenny?
Oh, now she's gone away. It's all working, Jen. Don't worry.
Okay, I'll pass on to Nadia.
Yeah. Hi everybody. I'm Nadia. I'm joining from South Moravia in the Czech Republic, and I'm a researcher at Masaryk University in Brno, and I'm looking forward to the discussion very much. And pass on to Laura.
Hi everyone, I'm Laura. I'm a PhD candidate in Italy. Currently, I'm actually in Rotterdam, attending a summer school. So yeah, the weather is quite gray, but warm, so it's nice. And I pass to Christina.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm Christina. I'm an artist, a freelance artist, and I'm calling from where I am based. I'm from Malta, and it's very sunny, warm, hot actually, rather than warm. And I'll pass on to Pieta.
Hello, I'm Pieta. Now calling from southern Finland. Yesterday I traveled to Eastern Finland. I work at the University of Eastern Finland as a postdoctoral researcher, and yeah, the weather is great here. I'm looking forward to getting out after this discussion, but I'm also looking forward to the discussion. I will pass on to oh dear, Thomas. You haven't said anything?
Yeah, hi everyone. Tom here, calling in from the north of Spain. Nice to see lots of familiar faces, a couple of new faces as well. Unfortunately, I can only stay till past, so I will quickly pass on so that I can hopefully engage with the session in some way. I will pass to Karen.
Hi. Have been based in Norway and now in Salzburg, where I'm about to start a new position at the Mozarteum University and as a professor of artistic research. I used to be a sociologist, did a lot of work with Community Economies Collective, and then now I'm doing art and want to return to community economies. So it's wonderful to rejoin you all. Sangwan.
I am Sangwan. I'm a PhD student in geography at the University of Oxford, and I'm trying to finish my dissertation as soon as possible, which draws a lot on community economies scholarship. And I always feel really, really thankful that I have met Katherine Gibson while I was doing my fieldwork in Korea, which has led me to this place so far. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I will pass on to Pete North.
Hello, everybody. Pete North. I'm here in Liverpool, but I've been watching what's been happening in Warsaw over the weekend with a fair amount of horror. So looking forward to this discussion. I'm not sure who hasn't spoken yet. Anna, have you spoken yet? Who else is there?
Marcus hasn't.
Marcus.
Hello everyone, I'm Marcus. I call from Leipzig. Like Sangwon, I'm currently very much working on the dissertation, so my feeling is tired. But I'm also very happy, and it gives me good vibes to see so many familiar faces and also some yet unknown faces. And I think it's only Lucy left anymore. Could that be?
Thanks. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Lucia Sobova, and I'm calling from Wageningen in the Netherlands, where I'm a researcher. And yeah, we just lost the government yesterday. So exciting times. I'm gonna pass to Katherine, right?
I think maybe Anne Charlotte.
Oh, and Charlotte.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
My name is Anne Charlotte. I'm French, but I'm currently based in Uzbekistan, where I teach sustainable development, and I do research on community economies. And I'll pass with.
Didn't hear that last bit. Was that to me or not?
I think it is.
It was.
Over to you,
Okay.
Kath.
I'll just introduce myself and then we can start the session. But yeah, so wonderful to see so many faces and so many people I know and others that I don't. So great to meet you all. And I can't believe I've never met Martin Parker. So I'm just so thrilled that I've got a face to attach to the name. So this is great. Yeah, and as Wendy said, I've just come back from being in Italy for almost 10 days teaching an intensive course with students at La Sapienza, the University of Rome, where a wonderful geographer, Cesare, has translated, and another translator have translated a whole lot of our work and produced a book. I'm not sure whether this will work. Will it work to show it? It's yeah, there it is. It's an Italian version where they've put the iceberg upside down, which I think is cute. And it was a great experience, but quite exhausting. So it was wonderful to have a few days with Wendy and Bolsena and at the beautiful convento where we've had many writing retreats pre-COVID, which just has a wonderful calming effect on you, I think, being in that place. It's so beautiful, the swimming in the lake and so on. So I'm feeling a bit rejuvenated, but still a bit tired. Seem to have got over the shingles that I had when I spoke to you all a month ago. So it's I'm adjusting to being away. Nice to be back in Lüneburg, where I'm based for until early July at Leuphana University, which has a big institute for cultural studies that I'm on the advisory board for. So it's having an interesting time here with a lot of the fellows who come for a year fully funded to write up stuff, but coming very much out of a humanities cultural studies background. So that's quite an interesting shift for me. And I'm really looking forward to meeting some of you next Friday down in Wendland, is it? Yes, with the Polectica Collective. So this trip to Europe is a great opportunity for me to kind of connect with a lot of people in the Community Economies Research Network. I'll be seeing Tim and Matt in July as well. So it's really great to be seeing you face to face, even though travel is such an arduous thing. It's worth it when you get to actually be hanging out with people. So yeah, anyway, great to have this CERN Europe activated again. And I'm very happy to be here as part of this discussion. So how do you want to do it, Matt?
Yeah, well, we thought maybe, thanks for that. We just thought maybe you could talk about the piece for a few minutes, and then I expect there's a lot to talk about and questions, etc. And we could just do it with a raised hand for questions once you've finished, or however that might work better. Yeah, and then so I'm trying to think in European time, so the session will finish at 12 Central European time, 11 UK time, and if we could just have 10 minutes for Anne Charlotte, if her internet connection holds out at the end, just to do some admin stuff, that would be amazing. If not, we can send information through email if the conversation is going on. So the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks, Matt, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I just thought this piece might be an interesting one for everybody to read. It gives a little bit of an overview of, I guess, the project that Julie and I started. It was written in because Antonio de Castellos, I'm going to get all the name, who's from Barcelona, was putting together a book, also of Spanish translations of J.K. Gibson Graham and other work from the Community Economies Collective, and they wanted to have another piece that was from me
to add to the collection of translations. And also there's an elaborated interview with me that she did, that she actually conducted at the Convento in Bolsena a few years ago. So, and I guess I was thinking, gosh, what to say, what to do. And so I ended up deciding just to write this letter to Julie some 10 years after she died. So it's got, as you can tell, a kind of more personal tone. And it was very much, I mean, it's interesting reading it now because that was very much in the context of the first year or so of the pandemic. And I feel like there was a lot of interesting and creative stuff happening in that time. And since then, you know, we're in a very different stage and state. So some of the discussion might well focus on what's happened since then. But I was kind of, I guess, arguing, or at least presenting the notion that some kind of a slow scholarship was needed, not to sort of jump in and try and have the analysis already sewn up. But and you know, being confronted with not knowing what to say, which I think is often happens within a community economies perspective, that it's not like we can read off some analysis so easily. And so trying to sit with that moment of not knowing and what comes through when you do that. So in there, I think it also kind of gives a bit of an overview of the kind of the way the work has developed and the ways in which it maybe could develop. And I thought maybe that would be a really great thing for us to discuss, some of the threads that could be picked up and taken further by people who are interested, which, you know, you guys are, in the sense that you've joined this research network. And so whether it's something I talked about the next step for post-development economics. I talked about kind of the assemblages that might allow for new kinds of subjects to emerge. Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what people think of the kind of threads that could be developed further within this kind of this body of work. It's also kind of was confronting for me to read the discussion at the end about breath and breathing, because actually since that time I ended up developing a autoimmune condition which hasn't got really any explanation. Could be, but the best explanation is environmental. So it's a form, it's called sarcoidosis, where the body attacks itself and creates scar tissue. And in my case, it was in the heart. So I had these incredible events once while I was on the fellowship at Harvard in 2022, and then a year later when I was swimming with my daughter, of suddenly my heart going into tachycardia, so that the ventricles start sort of wobbling at 260 beats per minute, which can put you into cardiac arrest. And that mainly it was because of this scar tissue that's built up that interrupts your electrical currents in your heart. So I've had to go on various kind of treatments, which have been pretty horrible, drug treatments to deal with this. And during the time we were away overseas, one of our cats died, and the vet said to us, lots of small animals are dying of these carcinogens that were in the atmosphere because of the bushfires a year before. So small animals are dying because of the effect that the smoke haze that we were breathing for weeks. And also we were living in Sydney, in the worst part of polluted part of Sydney, which collects all the kind of air pollution and traps it in the western part of Sydney, which is, you know, where the Western Sydney University is. So anyway, I just sort of thought maybe there's some kind of connection between that environmental impact and me developing this particular syndrome. I actually mentioned it to my cardiologist, and he started thinking of all his other patients with the same thing, and they all seem to live next to national parks where they did controlled burning. So he's got a PhD student looking at the connection. But, you know, it's sort of interesting to think that, I don't know, perhaps I was also affected in ways that I didn't know. And I think a lot of people have been affected, obviously, by COVID in so many ways. It's really disrupted many people's lives, but also disrupted, you know, political agendas and etc. So there's the momentous things have occurred since that time that I think bear thinking about, but it doesn't take away, I suppose, from the kind of work that we're doing. But it also, there's a way in which I suppose there's been a resurgence of a form of capitalist-centric analysis. I don't know whether it's associated with capitalist realism. I'd love someone who's read that work to be able to explain what it really is. But there's a sense in which there's doing the work of critique of capitalocentrism never ends, and it seems to have got harder in recent times. There's so many ways in which the big stories keep getting consolidated. And I'm finding that with the students that are the early career of the researchers that are here, who are all coming out of humanities. And for all of them, capitalism is still the master signifier that's organizing their thinking about neoliberalism or about science fiction. And I'm kind of thinking, gosh, there's, you know, to try and tell our small stories against those big ones is still a big challenge. And yet, when you do start telling the stories, the actual practical stories of what is going on, for instance, the wonderful field trips that people in Italy took me to at the edges of Rome, these incredible squatter settlements that have been going on for 20 years, this incredible rewilding around a toxic lake on the edge of Rome where there's a huge new commons that's been established. I mean, each of those stories has so much richness to them and need to be told, to be kind of fight back against this kind of this way in which so much is being kind of woven together, and to keep, I guess, keep ensuring up capitalist hegemony. You know. Anyway, I'm interested to hear what you think of that and what you think of what's been happening since the time that we wrote. And you know, in my usual style, I was trying to pick out all the pointers that showed the prevalence of community economy practices already here, but that work of weaving them together into something that's more of an assemblage or a meshwork that can be the basis for perhaps supportive policy or something that makes them more durable is still, I think, an agenda that is for us to work on. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts about how to do that, because of all people around, you guys and us are, you know, refusing to fold everything into one big story that leads us with nowhere to go. So on the other hand, recognizing the power of some of those big stories. And we had a session recently in the Community Economies Institute about the need to do more work on anti-colonial thinking and work within our network, and the powerful, you know, the powerful big story of colonialism that's still needing a big story, I think, to be told. And the way we engage with that is something that I just briefly touch on in this piece, but don't really develop. So there's lots of interesting work to be done using the tools that I think we've developed. And it's really quite an interesting and open agenda at the moment. So yeah, I guess I'm interested just to hear your reactions to the piece, whatever thoughts came up when you read it, from small to large. And I'll leave it at there, so we can kind of have an open discussion. So I don't know whether we want to just have responses to the piece first, or people want to pick out particular issues to discuss. I'd kind of be interested to hear both sides of it.
Yeah, I think it might be. Thank you for that. It would be great to have some initial responses to the piece, I think, at first,
Yeah.
and then a wider discussion afterwards. So anybody who's navigating Zoom, then the heart-shaped react button at the bottom will give you the raising your hand. And if you, maybe we could do it like that, but maybe I could have the first seeing as though I've got my mic open. I just wanted to ask something about the form of the piece, because it's a letter, and that is obviously an ancient form of communication, and it's also a letter that's written in a context which is very particular, and struggled to write my PhD during those years of isolation, and it produced a very kind of reflective piece, which was slightly problematic when it kind of came into the open, if you like. And I just wonder if you could just talk a little about the letter as form and the context that within which we write, because I think we all find the context that we're writing at the moment incredibly difficult. And also just to say that I found the piece incredibly open and emotional. I read the first paragraph to somebody I was in a writing group with the other day to explain what I was doing, and they cried. So I'm interested in that kind of connection that is provided by that form that you chose and the context within which you wrote it. So just a few comments on that would be lovely.
Yeah, well, thanks, Matt. I actually cried when I read it again. So, yeah, I don't know. I think I'd never really sat down and thought about communicating, apart from having conversations in my head to some extent with Julie. I think I'd never done that to actually sit down and try and address her, So it seemed like a approachable thing to do. I just didn't feel like I had another piece in me to write that was separate from that connection. So it kind of seemed to flow quite easily, but it also, I think in our writing together, we always tried to attend to affect and emotion, and what what thinking does. And so to bring that into this letter was kind of more like the kind of work we always did together. And I think some of the things I've written since by myself don't have that same tone, or don't have, it's very hard to shift from that academic voice into one that allows for emotion and affect to really filter in. And yet, to me, it's much more engaging, I think, when one does that, because it's also kind of more honest in a way. And it's like one of the things I think about when I listen to these students or these people, these fellows here. I think, why are you doing this? What is your emotional connection to this project you've got? So I think bringing that stuff to the fore is important. And yeah, so the letter was a way to kind of start to do that. And in so many ways that it's been incredibly busy since Julie died. So it was also a time to sort of sit and just reflect and reflect on what's happened, which I think she'd be quite amazed by, and maybe even, I don't know what her response would have been to it. I mean, she would have been 80 a week or so ago. So, probably, given that we're both, well, I'm quite a bit younger, but I'm still getting to the point where I know my output is diminishing, or my ability or my kind of energy to do the kind of high level thinking and reading that might be necessary to keep going is starting to wane a little bit. Things might have been interesting to see what would have happened if she'd stayed, if she'd lived on. But I thought, yeah, the letter was a good way of doing that kind of accounting to some extent, and easier to do as a letter and less pretentious, perhaps. I mean, there's a way in which people do kind of big note themselves and their projects, and I feel like this has been such a collective effort. It's really nice to kind of try and map it out to some extent. Yeah. I can see Wendy has a hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Katherine and Matt. Yeah, I just wanted to say that it was very moving, and also knowing how you and Julie work together and how you've continued somehow to work with her. I think that's something that's been very inspiring for many people, and I really appreciated the honesty of the letter. And I would say that, just continuing what you said, that kind of emotion and effect, but actually being able to put it down actually is very, very helpful for us thinking, how do we work, how do we go forward, how do you work with others, and how do you go slowly, stay with the emotions and deal with the troubles we're in. I mean, to sort of with Haraway in mind, but I mean, I think that the letter really is a helpful way to share what's going on. It made me think I wish people would write more such letters, if you like, because it helps. You felt what you were feeling. I mean, no wonder it was very moving in that sense. So I was thinking, as part of the CERN thing of smaller stories, this was a very big story in a way for the CERN network. What you have worked through with Julie, and then very generously with so many others. So it just made me think these are kind of it's important to have some of these moments recorded somehow in these letters, not just by you, but by others. I mean, CERN seems to be an expanding network and doing so many different things. It's not just about the tools that are being produced, it's also the connections. I was thinking it would be inspiring to hear more, I mean, in such letter writing or such ways of being able to share with other people and to experiment a bit in that form of writing. I was so I just wanted to say that because I myself more towards Kath's age than maybe everyone else here, but I'm also thinking of how do you write ways that bring out emotion and effect that really speak to the heart and are honestly doing that. I think that's very important, and I really appreciate that the letter sort of guided that through. It made me think, yes, this is something that we could be doing more of. So thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Anyone else want to jump in just with a response or reflection? Yeah, and Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for sharing this story about your letter. Diane Singer, my entourage, I have shared the link of her interview on the Padlet. I think she did this interview at the same time when you wrote your letter, and basically she has the same questions as you and the same hope for the future. So at the beginning of the video, she says, I didn't know when the pandemic started, should I be productive and create another album, or should I actually use this time to be closer to family and friends? I thought that the end message of her interview resonated really well with the end message of your letter. At the end, she says, I hope that the whole world is using this time to think about ways of making this world better. And so I thought it was interesting to see how we are here in a research community and we are thinking about making the world better, but the creative community is also thinking about it. So many communities around the world saw that this pandemic was a real problem and tried to find ways to make it better. Yeah, thank you.
We didn't quite catch, you dropped out a little bit there, and Charlotte, I'm just wondering, we didn't quite catch who the person was you mentioned?
It was Mayra Andrade, singer from Cabo Verde. I'll write her name in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great, thanks. Martin, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Lovely letter, beautiful form. I was just wondering about it's a kind of reflection on the way in which community economy stuff is growing. And obviously one of my interests, because that's where I work, is the business school. And I'm wondering how you feel now, maybe what you might say to Julie about the way in which community economies work is growing in business schools. And I suppose just to prefigure that slightly, it makes me both anxious and happy that there seems to be an increasing number of people who are interested in this kind of work. But I'd be really interested in your reflections on it too.
So can you talk a bit about the anxiety?
Oh, no, I'd like you to, but all right.
I don't know.
Well, then I suppose it's the dangers of co-optation and so on, isn't it? You know, business schools historically and in contemporary terms, are places for reproducing capitalism, not just capitalocentrism, but actual capitalism. And though it's kind of pleasing to see fragments of another world beginning to grow within these particular institutions, there's also, I think, a real danger in which community economies work then just gets kind of commodified in terms of a particular sort of research approach or a certain way of thinking about entrepreneurship or small business or something along those lines. I seem to have answered the question I wanted you to answer, Katherine.
Yeah, well, you're the one that's closest to the business schools. I mean, interestingly, the first thing I did here in Lefana was at like coffee talk, and someone that came to it had started his PhD at Leicester the time when Julie and Jenny were there for the conference that I think Gibson Burrell and you and maybe you were involved in, and now they've written the whole book about the closure of the business school, or at least the whole thing that happened there. And it looks like Bristol's the last outpost now.
There's other places.
There must
Bristol's
be other places. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, he told the whole story about what an impact reading The End of Capitalism had on his first year of his PhD, and then this book's all about what happened there and the struggle and so on. So I guess they're business schools. Yes, it's nice, interesting to know that people might be reading this work and thinking about it, but it's still in a minor voice, I would think, given the nature of business schools around the world. Yeah, I mean, I think, the question of co-option comes out all the time, and I think it's something that we've got no control over to some extent, except to be involved in the struggling against co-option. It's like highlighting what are the principles or the kind of values of an ethical economic practices, and continually raising those as what are the negotiating points here? What are the points on which ethical practices are going to be specified or made into law or into regulations and so on, and trying to kind of show, of course, anytime these things can be kind of taken and manipulated, I suppose, but in a way that we've got no control over how that work gets taken up and used. It's a matter of keeping engaging with the people that are using it and having those discussions, it seems to me. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see what's going on in business schools, as opposed to, say, in, I've had a kind of interesting engagement with social economy thinkers and trying to use community economies and diverse economies work to broaden out their vision of what could be involved in an economy where, for purpose is put at the center and so on, especially given the United Nations kind of recognition now of social economy as the future and that needs to be addressed. So it's there's ways in which that group, at least the European social economy crowd, also do that work they almost do the work of co-opting for themselves. They kind of they look at examples and see how they're just shoring up the state, or this is the whole issue of isomorphism and so on. But again, it's like theoretical work to be done to show why it isn't, why a particular enterprise or whatever is working against the mainstream, or could it, and could the research that you do actually help them figure out how to do that in a different way? So I feel like the co-option argument is really just an invitation for more work, like to work with people to think about where are the moments in which you might want to make an allegiance with a particular state policy, or you might not, and what is it going to enable or not enable, and be strategic around these kinds of things, rather than assume that just because you might get funding from a government agency, that immediately puts you in thrall to a certain kind of agenda. So I guess if you start with an over-determinist or an anti-essentialist perspective, then everything becomes an empirical challenge to kind of do the work and actually try and help build the resistance to being taken over by a for-profit agenda or whatever. And giving people the skills to do that is what I think needs to happen at a business school. I mean, it's like, it's doing the thing, giving people or helping people get the thinking tools to kind of keep resisting the dominant narrative and think against it to some extent, where you can. And obviously not everywhere you can. A lot of places there's ways in which, you have to accept defeat, I think, or accept that this is not going to be a place where a productive or enabling assemblage is going to be built. And so I guess we've always taken that view of a bit like the water, moving where you can. You move to where you can work, as opposed to trying to take on the big, the big river kind of thing. So that's that, I think, what Freya Matthews used, that kind of Taoist method of working with the power that's going to help you move forward, and having more attempts to try and figure out where that is and what it is, I think is the skill that needs to students anyway need to develop. And it's too easy to fall into the, yes, it's always going to go down this track and get co-opted. But yeah, so I'd say it is, yes, it's heartening and it's also worrying, but with any kind of growth of, I think the thing about our work is that maybe this is something to get some reflections on. I feel like there's not an orthodoxy, at least in terms of content. There's a bit of an orthodoxy in terms of stance. Like the stance that we take is one that is questioning and trying to not presume dominance. Now, that could be seen as an orthodoxy in a sense, but it's not like there's a particular analysis that everyone has to toe the line of. I think I'm hoping that the growth of the network is a network that she sees that the work is evolving and changes, but what doesn't change is a kind of an openness to thinking otherwise and doubting. And whenever you see that kind of work, genealogical work, or powerful voice, the big voice, this is the analysis thing, kind of always start slightly taking a bit of a perverse step back and say, well, wait a minute, let's try and read this a different way and see what happens. So it's that idea of making sure the work, you ask, what is the effect of thinking it this way or that way? And giving people the kind of confidence to try and do that work, I think. Yeah. But
that's a lovely answer. Just very quick reflection in return. There seems to be an increasing number of people who are talking about strategy on the kind of the broadly green left, something like that, in terms of this idea that we might need rather more flexible understandings of the sort of organizational structures, assemblages, apparatus, whatever, that are going to be required in order to deal with some of the problems that face us, and that kind of implies that kind of a whole bunch of other institutions, including the state and maybe big capital, might need to be assembled as part of that. Yeah, and that's kind of tricky, isn't it? Because it pushes against any sort of purist politics.
Well, that's right, and I guess that's always been our tendencies to try and push against that.
Just so
the and I think the left and other groups have been kind of hogtied by their purity in terms of trying to have those conversations. So, and I point to the work Jenny and Stephen and I and Joe McNeil have done on manufacturing, where some of our key people were in capitalist firms, and we were arguing that they were still doing a form of just sustainability alongside the social enterprises and cooperatives that we were also interviewing. And so to see those firms being part of assemblages with social enterprises trying to do more sustainable forms of manufacturing, I think is opening up that I don't know, that area, which for some traditional leftists or whatever, they might be horrified by. But I think if you take, and then if you go down to the subject level of these particular individuals, they're all interested in problem solving in different ways. They're not particularly only motivated by profit making. There are all sorts of other interesting dynamics, I think, that go on in capitalist firms that where they've got very long-term agendas, they've got commitments to workforces and so on. So it does open up, but it's not. What it's doing is opening up capitalist enterprise to difference in itself, which I think we're always interested in doing, but we haven't done as much of. And so everyone associates community economies work with the non-capitalist forms of enterprise, but I think you can be doing a form of community enterprise research, community economies research with the diversity within capitalist enterprises. But there'll be lots that we would think are doing abominable things, and they need to be exposed. So that's where that kind of strong theory kind of argument needs to be probably harnessed as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Catherine.
Pete, you had your hand up, but you took it down again.
Yeah, because I just loved what you said just before what Martin said, Kath, and I don't know why you say you're slowing down, because that was just fantastic.
A few years ago.
No. It's still great. I've just read a book with an awful title by something called the Salvage Collective, talking about the proletario scene. And I read it because it said it's a call for climate communism. So I thought, well, I'll read that. But it was awful. It was just every big capitalist story you could tell about how awful it is. And at the end, it says, and we therefore need a communist revolution, even though it's unlikely. And I thought, oh, good luck with that, lads. So I was going to hang back and see if other people wanted to carry on with the discussion that you started about sort of assemblages and broadening out, and resisting the idea that because you're successful, you're being co-opted, rather than just no, you're getting better at what you're doing, and you're resisting the idea that if something's successful, it's because it's capitalist, rather than it's successful in different ways. I was, if people want to carry on with that, great. What I was going to say was, because I had a different COVID to you. I had quite a nice COVID in that things slowed down, and our family, we were all at home. We could both work online. It was actually quite hard work because we had to keep the students going through online, but it wasn't too bad. I did a walk every day through these woods just down the road from where I live, and I observed the spring opening up, and it was really nice. And I remember we had discussions online through CEI where we read what Bruno Latour wrote about what a think piece about what has COVID stopped that you don't want to start up again. And what are the opportunities for a sort of slower, more mindful, perhaps more localized, ecologically sustainable, because it's just not so quick, and not, the emissions of the world shot down during that period. I'd be interested to know what you think has carried on from that, or have we collectively repressed the growth button and we're firing ahead in all cylinders, and we've lost all that. And the story here is, the economy is in a mess because of all that money that was spent looking after people in COVID, which now needs to be paid back. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about sort of more positive sides of COVID that might have lasted, or was it that with your health issues and the wildfires, it's more difficult for you to see that? Because for me, the awful bit with our family happened when the world started and my daughter got ill. But during COVID, it was a nice time.
Yeah. Thanks, Pete. Well, I mean, I guess it kind of comes back to that question of how might we even track the impacts of some of those changes during the COVID period, because I think it's easy to see them as all ended, that then everyone went back to some sort of new normal, although it didn't. I mean, certainly in Australia, the whole working from home thing changed dramatically, and our conservative politicians tried to, in the last election, say everyone should be working back at work again, and there was this huge backlash from women, as if they didn't understand anything about family dynamics and others. So it's definitely been put on that's changed and it stayed. The idea that people have the freedom to think about working more from home or working more a four-day week has definitely has become a much more accepted thing. So there's a few things you can immediately pick up on, saying, well, that was sort of an effect of this massive experiment that happened during COVID, which it was a huge social experiment, really. But then I wonder how many of the other things that happened have never been really documented or tracked, and that's where that idea of kind of a community economy return on investment, is something that could be very useful in trying to interact with policymakers around about future directions. But in general, we don't have the techniques to try and document what impact did it have that you actually started to connect differently with people in your neighborhood. Suddenly you maybe nodded to people. I mean, I certainly got to know a lot more people in my neighborhood than I ever had done before, just because of going out walking every day and chatting to people. So I felt much more embedded in a place that I'd just been as a commuter for many years. But what impact did that have? I mean, how do we ever encapsulate that kind of impact on mental health or on family relations? Where is the opportunity to sort of say, these are the things that actually were created during that time of exception, and how many of those things might we want to hang on to, So I feel like it's very easy to fall back into yes, we just went back into the growth model, and in fact what happened is, the conspiracy theorists sort of started to grasp more control on social media, and that kind of divisions that started to occur in families and so on around vaccinations and so on started to get exacerbated. But yeah, I guess there's some of the epidemiologists that have tried to do the long-term tracking of the impact of these changes, but it would be interesting to put a community economies thinker alongside the epidemiologist to try and look at the more broader impact. How many more people started growing food at home, for instance, or started sharing things or caring for people in different ways. And this is, to me, this is something that could, if we did that, it could feed into the arguments like I tried to make about some sort of a livable income guarantee, where if people actually had some minimum livable income, what could they be doing, like these kinds of practices that would give them meaning and help with physical and mental health and so on. So I feel like it's hard to say, and it's very, again, it's sort of easy to do everything went back to normal and look what happened to politics. And it's harder to try and do the other because we don't have the ways of the metrics, in a way, the ways of collecting that information. All we have are the small stories. So how do we make the small stories speak to big things is the question. There's an interesting piece of research that's just come out in Australia from the Institute of Family Studies, which shows that men that had a good relationship with their fathers are much less, almost like really much less likely to be involved in any kind of domestic abuse. It's quite a large study that shows the quality of your relationship with your father is so important. Now, if you took that into social policy, that would mean putting a lot of effort into fathers having the chance to be at home a lot more, all these kinds of things. So I think it will start to have maybe some impact, but it's in a way that's sort of, that's where I think some thinking of community economies work at a more policy level, at a more national level, would be really interesting to do, to sort of think about, if we did this kind of thing, what would be it, how much would we save in terms of, domestic violence or imprisonment or whatever, and as a way of speaking back to the number crunches and so on. So that I'm kind of interested in people taking on that return on investment idea to flesh it out a bit more, which I think there is some interest in. The other thing I just wanted to say about, you started off talking about successful things and so on. I think there's also, there's a way in which we shouldn't shy away from failures and analysing failures, but also not thinking that failures don't have some sort of long-term effect and some sort of impact that is actually helpful too. So, I think that we've been very much dominated by a short-term time frame, and when we think about impact, it has to be immediate or it has to be large. And how do we think about impact over 10 or 12 or 2 generations or whatever? And something that might have failed, one of the examples that I have is the Australian Assistance Plan that was introduced for only 3 years under the Whitlam government in Australia in the 70s. And it was the first attempt to try and do community development and give money down to communities that the federal government, bypassing the states, was funding all these experiments all over Australia and in Glebe, where I was living, people started an adventure playground, and they did all sorts of things. And this policy only lasted for 3 years because the government was ousted. And yet 10, 15 years later, when Jenny and I were doing interviews in a country town in Shepparton, someone said, during that Australian Assistance Plan intervention, so many women came out of their houses and started to doing community work, and then went on to university and got training, and now they're all in local government. And they just kind of suddenly said that had a huge impact on people's lives, that then led to all sorts of other things that contributed to different kinds of social policies. And I thought, yeah, that's the kind of long-term effect that we never really track, and people put it down, oh, that was a short intervention, nothing ever happened. But actually the people affected went on in all sorts of ways in this kind of rhizomatic kind of pattern, and it had huge effects. And luckily a master's student at Monash finally went and interviewed the top woman bureaucrat who'd been involved in that, to try and track down some of this. But there could be more to be done around that kind of thing. But again, it's like having the framing to try and trace those stories and make them more than the individual story is the task, I think. Nadia's got a hand up.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the return on investment and the idea that we have to look at the long-term effects that you've just been speaking about, and I agree. But at the same time, I think it's ambiguous to try to. There is a danger if you try to change these things into numbers. There's a big discussion in ecological economics about ecosystem services, where there's been a long tradition of quantifying the so-called services of nature. And the arguments against that are that we are really sort of kowtowing to the economists, trying to quantify something which is unquantifiable, and giving very uncertain numbers to things which are really priceless. So I was just wondering if you actually meant some quantification, because I think that's very tricky. And it's really getting into the mainstream sort of, yeah, of course, the number crunchers will understand us better, but will we lose some kind of integrity on the process of quantifying?
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. I think again, it's very contextual, and I think at the macro level, I could understand that kind of. It seems like it's just kind of subsuming things, and in a way that maybe is not that helpful. But in particular contexts, the idea of quantifying in terms of trying to make an argument on what could happen if EU investment went into the Rurban project, for instance, and the way in which we tried to use that with that article, what actually emerges from it is creating all sorts of forms of sustainability, which you don't have to quantify, but if you do, you can say, well, this investment created this kind of savings for the planet, for instance. I mean, it's just one way of communicating with it, with people, I think. One of the interesting pieces on ecological services, I think, has been written by 2 geographers talking about the ways in which it's been used in Aboriginal communities in Australia, where rangers and others have been now employed to do ecological servicing. And now, of course, it's really just recognising what they've always ever done, which is care for country. But it's given them an opportunity to actually get an income from doing the work of controlling feral animals and this kind of thing. So in that context, the quantification has been a useful strategic, it comes back to the strategy question, a useful strategic tool to actually get investment back into local communities on country, so people can stay there and do stuff. But it's framed within, well, they're producing an ecological service. So it's complicated, I think. And I would, rather than just, I don't want to see the environment as this extractive service-driven thing, but how do we open it up to see the value of caring for country and in a wider context, and sometimes showing how, yeah, showing the numbers and the funding agent, the side of it all is one way of getting that support. So yeah, I think it's one of those things to approach with caution, but also with an openness to what might be possible in particular contexts. And I think Ethan's written a bit of this about this in his Ecological Livelihoods book, about a critique of ecological economics and services and so on. So it's like it's a live discussion. It would be something to come back to and have a broader discussion about, I think. Thanks for that. Christina has a little hand up.
Hi, Kath.
Hi.
Thanks so much for this, for sharing this letter and for this conversation. It really resonates with me in so many ways, especially what you said about not about moving away from purism in all kinds of ways. And I mean, I think what you just talked about with Nadia, can be seen as, a methodological purism and not, being afraid of, I mean, numbers can be used in all kinds of ways. You also discussed it in the fields we engage with and the kinds of enterprises we engage with. And I think it's so important to, right now, especially to speak, to be able to speak the language of power in some way, because I think that's something, and it's also present in your letter in many different ways. Our work never makes the headlines, and it's difficult to really communicate this work in a way that's glossy and catchy, and is, so I think there's a lot of work to be done in copying power, in a sense, and trying to kind of hack those really registers of language and thought that are out there. And I really I really hope that that's a future direction of what we're doing. I had a really interesting workshop yesterday with some colleagues, where one of my close colleagues kind of came out with this exasperation, where he said, there's this paradox I'm seeing in the world right now, where there's all these amazing alternatives to capitalism, bubbling everywhere. And then he said, and then this sense that these are, just highly unlikely, that these are just increasingly utopian. And that was a starting point for a really interesting discussion, because it wasn't like a skepticism that was, dismissive of these alternatives, but it was, we really went into that affect as well of kind of losing hope and being anxious. And one thing that came out there was, which I hadn't read at all, was the work of the last book of Escobar on relationality. And there was a really interesting concept from that book that I learned yesterday called ontological slippage. So it's basically the idea that, when you're trying to change something or to transform, in that context, from a non-relational way of being in the world to a relational one, what we automatically do is to fall into our default modernist settings of, assessing failure and success along these kind of big monolithic lines or these linear paths. And that was just a really helpful concept to think with, because, all these anxieties we have about it not having enough effect or not being big enough might also have to do with our own ways of assessing success and recognizing failures. So yeah, I just wanted to share that concept, that it really resonated with me and with this discussion. So
yeah, oh, that's great. Thanks. It's interesting to hear about people's discussions in the world, doing what you're doing and then hearing what you come up against, for instance. And I mean, that reminds me a lot of the argument that is in Hospicing Modernity, which is arguing that, we're all subjects of modernity to some extent. And so it's very hard to totally step outside of the way that modernist thinking has framed us and brought us up and so on. So it's not unusual to think that the ontological slippage can go back in, no matter how much you're trying to work to do that more anti-essentialist reading or anti-modern reading, it always pulls you back to some extent. But being conscious of it, I think, is the first step, and also being part of a group that's conscious of it and can discuss it is obviously another aspect. And in a way, it does allow, it provokes thought, because if you realize that you're always going to get drawn back into that, it provokes you to think, how do I not be, and what do I need to think, or how could I think in order to do it differently, or to have a different kind of affect. So I find that's been a creative urge, that kind of form of perversity has been always something that has given rise to new stuff for me. And so but it is, the doubts and the feeling like it's not good enough, et cetera, is, pulling you back into that other kind of more modernist. It has to be big before it has to be durable, before it's going to make any change, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, the other thing is what she points out in that book is just the temporality, the way in which we're so obsessed with such a short-term vision of temporality. And, if you kind of do try and step back a bit from the now and the next 10 years and think about things in a more long-term perspective, it's, perhaps helps take the pressure off a little bit, but it also diminishes one's vision of one's own power, because you see yourself as very much insignificant in the scale of things. And not at the same time. I mean, that's why I found David Wengrow and David Graeber's book so interesting, to think about those long periods, thousands of years of societies that lived with much more redistributive forms of governance and ways of living that were more subsistence oriented and very much around mobility and so on. It just gives you a whole sense of how worlds are different or could be different, and what does that give rise to in a modernist context that we're so bound by the nationalism and the way colonialism has structured things. So it's it's a mixture of that kind of taking on a particular stance and then using the tools we have in hand to try and do that other kind of thinking. But that's great to hear, thanks. And Marcus has written something about a qualitative approach to, that's great, Marcus. That's the kind of thing that Kelly's been developing, which is also harnessing storytelling towards that end. Yeah. Right. Wendy jumping in again.
Yeah, sorry to jump in again. I just wanted to say that really resonated, Christina, what you said, and really important to hear right at this moment when you're teaching, particularly really younger people who are really have gone into the dystopic sort of futures, and feel that with climate crisis, climate anxiety is a sort of, for them, almost what they see as their future. So I think you're absolutely right. I just wanted to say it's very important, these other ways of moving away this ontological slippage. And thank you very much. That's going to be a very useful thing for me, because I'll be teaching next week on utopias and dystopic narratives, and how in the context of climate change and anxiety. And I find that some of the most difficult thing to sort of, I almost feel it's an intergenerational thing of how to get people to go away from these big narratives and to trust that they do have something there that is a future, because some of them feel there is no future. So this is a very, very useful conversation. Thank you.
Oh, Karen.
I wanted to echo that this thread of ontological politics and ontological slippage has been really alive for me. And as I mentioned in the intro, I was initially a sociologist and then got increasingly interested in art, and it's super exciting to see art becoming more and more present in community economies work. But I think my attraction to art has been around on, like how art can play with this ontological politics and other narratives, and bringing this to art schools. And the program that I will now start teaching in it's a PhD program premised on non-Western ontologies. And so it's very exciting. And even just to share, like in this conversation, Kath, as you're talking about this importance of policy implications. I internally struggle with like ontological politics, policy, like just how to do it all. So I don't know, it's just coming up for me about the different ways of directing our energies in this work. And yeah, my own internal struggle, like, is ontological politics enough? And what about the more material implications of this? So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about how we internally work with our own approaches within all of this work. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any grand thoughts on that, but I'm really going to be interested to see what comes up, Karen, for you in the work that you're doing. And I presume the art is very broadly defined, including narratives on radio and actual visual arts and other things too. I'd be interested to hear what kind of style of practice that you'll be working with.
Yeah, I mean, there's working through different mediums. I mean, going back to the affect in the letter and the writing, the kind of writing in Letter to Julie, opening up what we think of as knowledge, what are the ways who are we addressing? What is even unreflected in the way we use language in this thing called knowledge? And that art, there's this beautiful idea of speaking nearby that Trinity Minha, filmmaker, uses, and this, that everything can be poetic. It doesn't have to be, like everything, we can inspire each other in these poetic ways, which I think is a really different ontology of what knowledge is, and a kind of transmission that's, sharing knowledge in different forms that are outside the norm of academic language.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like I've said this to other people, but I don't know who to. There's a symposium around the Handbook of Diverse Economies coming out in Rethinking Marxism, and the editors invited a few people to write responses to the book. One's by George DiMartino and Eileen Graeber, who helped us with, they gave us feedback to the people who are writing the framing chapters. But another is by Matt Scobie, who's a young Maori scholar, with another person from New Zealand looking at the handbook from a kind of more decolonial perspective. But the others by the Black African American political economist and feminist Jessica Gordon Nembard, who's written a lot around kind of Black solidarity economies and so on. And what she talks about is the role of joy in building community economies, and how within the communities that she's researched of these women's collectives and cooperatives historically of African American women, that the actual practice of increasing, livelihoods and well-being was always accompanied by a certain kind of joy, which often was expressed in cultural practices or artworks and other things. And she kind of is making that plea for us to kind of heighten that aspect of what we're doing. And I guess as a way of, I think it has a role to play in subjectivity and subject changes, and the confidence to actually engage with something else is going to come through a feeling that you get from doing this kind of work that is joyful. And it kind of makes me wonder whether that's something we should be asking ourselves and our students. Like, is the work you're doing actually creating some joy for you or not? And is the practice that you're looking at, where can you see those kind of affects being generated, and to what extent do they have an impact on people's commitment to doing things, or their lack therefore? Because, you know, when you think about a lot of political organizing, I mean, anger and solidarity is often, and I guess there can be a joy associated with that, but it's not necessarily a kind of the creative aspect of joy, where that sort of sense of openness and connection. But anyway, it's kind of interesting angle that she's drawing attention to, that would be that's something to pursue, I think. And I guess, you know, art practices and another place where some of those features can really be nurtured, and getting people to do do practices like this. I mean, I think we showed that in a lot of the action research we've done, that kind of idea of getting together to make photo essays or to do things together is definitely part and parcel of the kind of the subjectivity issues and changes that I think what will be needed for a kind of a different kind of economic common sense to be more established. So yeah, really, it's great that there's such a group now of people who see themselves involved in various kinds of art practice within the network, and seeing how we can kind of, you know, tap into that work for those of us who don't see ourselves as artists or whatever. But I think that, again, that's one of those weird divisions that's problematic, you know, this idea that some people are artists and other people aren't, which I think Katherine Bohm and other people have really tried to address. So that idea of everyone can be a knitter or a maker, and what does that do? You know, thinking about this kind of thing. Yeah. Tim.
Yeah, I thought I'd jump in. Yeah, so for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been very involved in community housing. And actually, one of the ways that we kind of tried to sort of shift the work that we were involved in, was that we got a grant from the Arts Council to work with some architects who had previously won this contemporary art prize called the Turner Prize. So these architects could assemble. And that sort of set us off in a kind of interesting journey where we were trying to sort of bring in, you know, artistic practices or craft practices of making. And the last year, we've been particularly focused on retrofit, because basically we need to retrofit something like 25 million houses in the UK. Interestingly, in 2015, the government was going to bring in new standards for housing, and the house builders said no, this shouldn't happen. And so they got rid of these sort of future homes standards. And so all the houses that have been built since 2015 are going to need to be retrofitted, and at a cost of somewhere between 15 and 20,000 pounds per house. And so you're talking about millions of houses. So, you know, that's just the recent houses. So the whole thing is quite a mess. But the conversation has sort of made me think about something I was talking with colleagues about yesterday, which was there's an organization in Dorset which provides retrofit support to people on low incomes, but it's a private company. And they've asked us in this context is Dorset Community Energy, which is a community energy group, to go into partnership with them to set up something called a Dorset Retrofit Hub, which is like a one-stop shop for low-income households, but also homeowners. And it's kind of raised these sort of questions around sort of, you know, how appropriate is it to work with private companies? And actually within the retrofit space, it's full of private companies. You have architects who are doing design work, you have installers, you have builders, you have manufacturers. So you are kind of operating as a community economy organization within a space which is full of these private capitalist companies. So it's quite interesting. And I've been sort of as we've been talking, sort of thinking, okay, so how does this focus on language, subjectivity, collective action, how does that influence the way we, as a community energy group, engage in this space? And I'd be interested, if you had any thoughts on that, Catherine. But my immediate thoughts are around that in terms of language, it's to do with how do we shift from almost like capitalist solutions that focus on individual households delivering a product. And therefore, from a subjectivity point of view, you're just a consumer of services, products, whatever. How can you become with others, assessors, designers, installers? How do we introduce that sort of DIY element? And then I guess in terms of collective action, it's how do we shift the narrative so we're really bringing attention to these ethical choices about, say, the materials that we use or the way we work together. But that's my sort of, immediate thinking. But I'd be sort of interested if you had any thoughts about how we brought those three, aspects of community economy thinking into that space.
Yeah, that's a fascinating case there, Tim, to think through. It seems like it would be a topic of a great kind of workshop where we had more detail about all the different actors and so on. Sounds like the space is inhabited by a lot of small businesses, really. And, to what extent they are driven, how much they're driven by, super profit making versus making a living for those people who are in that business and so on, and what kind of are their pressures on them to operate in certain ways would be interesting to kind of map out, because it seems like those companies where there's not going to be that sort of cutthroat version of business are going to be the ones that perhaps you could work more effectively with to shift the dial a little bit. But is there going to be room for thinking about the retrofits on a more collective level, like a street level, or ways that actually could start to build different kinds of communities amongst the people in the houses? I'm assuming the retrofits are to bring them up to more ecological standards and heating and all that kind of stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, there's kind of two aspects. One is kind of looking at the building fabric, and so that's to do with insulation and other things. And the other is introducing things like heat pumps and possibly PV and batteries, so that kind of operational emissions are reduced and the cost is reduced. I mean, one of the interesting discussions we're having is with Dorset Council, and it's just compulsory purchased a property that's been empty for 20 years. And the proposition from us is that we take it on and we retrofit it through a training program. And the training program would be for young people, but also for people from the community who want to learn about retrofit. And then we would link that to, we started doing what's called archetypes assessments, where you look at particular types of houses. So we might say there's 20 different house types in Bridport, where I live. If you can do an archetypes assessment of each of those types, you can then give that information to householders in similar house types, and then find ways to encourage those groups of people to work together. So that's something else we also hope to do as well, sort of depending on funding.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds, and those houses some of them would be owned by people versus others would be rented, right?
Yeah, I mean this is the challenge that we have private rented, social rented, and then kind of owner occupied. And the social rented sector is kind of doing its thing, with government sort of impetus, I suppose, regulation and funding. The private rented sector is a real challenge, because where's the incentive or the regulation to force the landlords to do something? But in Dorset, 67 to 70% of houses are owner occupied. So, and within that, there's a lot of people who don't have the spare money to do retrofit. You know, they've got a big mortgage or whatever. So they're also looking to find ways to work with others to reduce costs. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, it'd be interesting to connect in with the project that Stephen's been leading in Sydney with social housing providers on climate readiness in social housing, because it's trying to look at design questions of social design too, like not just thinking about the nuts and bolts of the hardware of a house, but the actual ways in which people use space and interact with each other, especially to deal with urban heat. And I'm not sure that that's going to be such a big issue in your context, but there's kind of, I mean, the retrofit might be expanded, if we're thinking of it a community economies perspective, expanded beyond the kind of nuts and bolts to the more sociality of the environment and the connections that people could build around different practices that might help deal with, you know, living together in under climate changing circumstances and so on. So yeah, but that would be a great case to kind of think through what kind of language would be needed to help people make those connections across those divisions, and maybe reduce the sort of suspicion that you might have of the private contractors or whatever. But then it would also be interested to talk with them about what kind of relations they have within their own enterprises and what are the pressures on them. I mean, I'm reminded a little bit of a new book that's going to be coming out in our book series, which is all about professional cooperatives in Catalonia, where a lot of them are architectural groups and legal groups and others that have got cooperative organizations that have been going for a number of years, but that allows for certain kinds of freedoms. And it'd be kind of interesting to talk to the different actors in the retrofit industry about their own enterprise structures and what the pressures and what could be, how could they become maybe employee owned, or like actually think about community economy transitions in that area as well, and what would that enable in terms of the work they then do with people. And then the idea of trying to establish training for young people in the area as an opportunity to do that kind of work reminds me of Jo McNeil's work, where she looked at a lot of those big housing providers in the UK where local tenants then formed the companies that did the maintenance work on those buildings as a way of increasing their own, income security and so on. So yeah, I think we can talk about it when I come and visit, maybe, and do a little workshop with the Bristol crowd.
That's good, thank you.
Yeah, that's terrific. Great to have a case to kind of think with, It's always so, so helpful to kind of push things along a bit. Matt, you got your hand up.
Yeah, the beauty of community economies, really, isn't it? Because as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about a piece of research that I've been doing with the Bristol Play and Youth Alliance, who are up to maybe 50 organisations that have come together and have come since the pandemic. They've been working to coordinate pretty much the youth and play provision within the city, which took a real bashing during COVID and in times before that because of austerity and funding and so on, to the point where now they have, as members of the alliance, I think they took a long time to come up with the phrase alliance, but as an alliance, they actually have in the alliance the commissioning officers from the local authority are actually part of their alliance. So there's lots of things that have been whizzing around today, which this idea of co-option that Martin brought up. I think in some situations you find organisations co-opting the power of the problematic partner, if you like, which forever in Bristol has been the commissioning of services from the local authority. So yeah, it just really sparks me off to think about that in a different kind of way, and especially the letter with the language subjectivity and community action really helps to frame that world and what those people are doing. I kind of wanted to ask, we're kind of not nearly at the end, but we're not far off. But I just wanted to ask you a kind of bit of a tangential question, really, because when I was reading the letter, had to look up the word orthogonal, and yeah, an idea coming at a right angle.
Yeah.
I'm reading that as. I just wondered if you could kind of, I don't know, tell me what's the kind of the best orthogonal thought that you've had in your
Oh.
work, because that idea of provocation is,
Yeah.
I think, is really interesting, and something that I've taken from lots of things that you've written. So yeah, it'd be lovely to hear. I know it's a bit off topic, but as we're sort of approaching the end of the session, it'd be really nice to hear that.
Yeah, I don't know that I can put my finger on any one particular thing, but I think I think that for us, the introduction to a kind of an anti-essentialist version of economic thinking was a really big shift, and it was a relief, to be kind of released from that need to kind of have the big narrative and have the falling rate of profit. The argument was sort of structuring everything, etc. It's like we were having to sort of squish everything into this framing, and then suddenly to realize that there was another whole philosophical tradition that could allow that to be opened up, and that the work is the work of making these connections, not the work of revealing them to some extent. That made a huge difference. Now that wasn't so much I think that then gave rise to the ability to have orthogonal kind of relationships and connections. So I guess, putting together a lot of the feminist post-structuralist readings that I was being confronted with when I took over in women's studies at Monash, when we'd just come out of a whole kind of political economy framing. And yes, we knew about feminism and we were feminists and all that kind of thing, but then to suddenly kind of read about the decentered self and this kind of, and then to take that back into economics was, I guess, a kind of one of those orthogonal things where it's more like putting things together from different contexts and then seeing what comes out of it. And yeah, I think that then gave rise to lots of productive kind of insights and so on. But I think the stance of looking for that kind of outlier, looking for the things that are coming at you from a different angle is really what produces the new thinking and the creativity. So it's I can't think of any more specific example, but I think it's the cultivating that stance is the thing that kind of allows for those orthogonal stuff, those kind of things to emerge. I mean, certainly, each time there's been kind of ways in which we've revised what we're doing, the whole idea of trying to recontextualize the subject as more than human is, again, one of those real challenges. It's not like it's easy to do, and yet it was coming from a kind of a need to engage with that whole work that was coming out of environmental humanities and others about the multi-species being and so on. So to then try and bring that back into what a community economy looked like, that's a multi-species community economy, is it's not like we knew how to do it. But it was more like a commitment to try and then see what comes out of it. I think that's and I guess that's being open again to other developments around us and to ally ourselves with other ways of thinking that we think are productive and also politically needed. I think is another place that kind of generative action comes from. So I think that's probably as much as I can say about that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I'm lucky enough to work in an interdisciplinary research centre, so these orthogonal thoughts are there all of the time. And I guess part of what I'm thinking about is how you kind of allow those different ways of thinking in, especially when you might be confined by particular disciplinary conventions academically.
And different theorists have used different terms to kind of indicate the same kind of thing. Or Tim's just pointed to Tim Ingold, who also uses that language. But I mean, Deleuze and Guattari had the idea of lines of flight, and other people, Leonard Cohen has the cracks. It's like, and Nadia's used that notion of living in the cracks. That those images and metaphors that help you think differently are really important too. So, yeah, and I think if you're attracted to those kinds of that language, and those, like now we've got what was it, ontological slippage or something. There's ways in which, if you're open to these kinds of ways of thinking, then you'll collect together the kinds of language that will help you do that kind of work and communicate that kind of work.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and it's great to be able to share that. I think quite a few people needing to leave, I see, timing wise. Looks like Nadia has her hand up again.
Speaking about metaphors, I wanted to point to the metaphor of the knitting, which frames the letter.
Yeah.
And I really like that for many reasons. It resonated on many levels. So thanks for that.
Well, and it's interesting, Nadia. One of the first things we did when we were here in Lüneburg with the other fellows, we were taken to this cloister, which was like it's like an abbey where women have lived. They were originally Benedictine nuns from like the 1300s. Their place got burnt down in the 1500s and then rebuilt. So it's all still there. There's been a community of women living in this particular site on the edge of Lüneburg. When the Lutherans took over, they kind of closed down the convents and nunneries, but a group of women stayed there. But the people, the women that are there before the Lutheran kind of takeover, were incredible tapestry makers. And they did these incredible, huge kind of tapestries that they did as a collective. So you would, one group would work on one side and another on another side. And sometimes they got their measurements a bit wrong. By the time they got to the end, it was all a bit wonky and so on. But they're the most amazing pieces of fabric that have been made by many, many women. And they're all in this wonderful museum at this cloister, all kept under, temperature control and so on. But it just reminded me of this incredible collectivity of women's work that's been, largely ignored as art or whatever for centuries. And yet what it must have been to be able to be part of this, and with no electricity or anything, like how they actually did that fine work together. It's just, it's very inspirational. And I think craft work and women's crafts and anyone's crafts is an inspirational thing to think with for community economies. Tonight, we're going to be showing the Bamboo Bridge film, which I made with Juan Salazar, which is, again, a piece of, incredible craft production where the fabric of the bamboo is being used and worked with just as the community is being worked with. And it's going to be interesting to see how people read that, because it's often too easy, like, to read it as something that was of the past and so on. But yeah, these kinds of examples give you food for thought, and food for thinking through what community economies and community ethical relationships could be and can be, and also how long-standing they are. I mean, they're part and parcel of history for thousands of years. They're not something that we're just discovering now. They're something that's always been there, but it's been so overlooked. I can see Sangwon nodding his head here. I guess you're thinking about all the different practices in Korea that are so central to people's livelihoods that, again, aren't seen as the kind of Korean experiment or, economic development agenda, but which your research is going to be writing up. And I have an apology for not getting back to you on your paper, by the way, which I've read, and I always think I must get back to you about that. So good luck with those last finishing moments of the thesis.
Yeah, no worries at all. I was actually thinking about the practices that I've encountered during my case study in Korea, which is actually basically my paper is about alternative finance. But the thing is, I went to the AAG this year, end of March, and I participated in a session called Community Activism and Resistance to talk about my case study. But then I realized that the audience in that room draw on, like a particular book called Resistance Cannot Be Funded. So I have to make a lot of effort to say not revolution cannot be funded. I have to make a lot of effort to say no, not revolution should be funded. But yeah, it is really, on the one hand, difficult to think beyond capitalist-centric understanding of economy and finance, but at the same time, it is not just academically, theoretically convincing, but also personally, effectively liberating to think about what can be done and what has actually been done by the people that I luckily have had a chance to meet.
Yes, it's great because you work with this wonderful community, really a community economy that's been developed over the last 10 or 15 years right in the middle of Seoul. So doing really interesting ways of securing and shoring up people's well-being. Yeah. So watch this space. You can read more about it at some point. Well, maybe this is a chance to kind of wrap up and do some of the housework that needs to happen. But this has been such a pleasure to interact with you all and see what just hear from you and have your reactions. Thank you so much for all the time you put into reading and thinking, and I'm interested. Hopefully I'll be able to come along to a few more of these CERN meetings before I head down south into that other time zone, which makes it hard.
Catherine, for honoring us with your presence today.
Thanks.
I'll start the wrap up.
I'm wondering whether maybe if you took your video out, it might be better because your the sound comes in and out. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll start the wrap up if you don't mind.
Right.
Okay, so once again, thank you, and thank you to everyone who animated the discussions today. So for the next CERN-EU meeting, we chose so the next one will actually be on August 28th. And we would like to know if anyone is planning to join or if a lot of people are on vacation. So if you could, I don't know, react in the comments or just voice your availability on the video, like who is thinking to be available on August 20th for the next CERN-EU meeting.
I'll be back in Australia, so unfortunately, no.
Anyone else?
Very clever.
I think I'll also send a poll via email so that people can tell me in advance. If not a lot of people are going to participate, we will have to reschedule. So the next CERN-EU meeting will be me introducing my article about sustainable development goals and what is happening in Uzbekistan related to community economy.